All right, I guess we should go ahead and get started. Welcome to our weekly Saving Life on Earth webinar. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist here at the center, and we're so happy that you're joining us for these weekly conversations. Tomorrow is Endangered Species Day, and we are very excited about that, and we're having a contest on social media. So on the Center for Biological Diversity's Facebook page, Instagram page, and Twitter page, we've posted these intriguing pictures of different wild animals, and we're asking you to caption the wild. So put in what you think is going on in the picture, and in a totally scientific process, at the end of the week, we'll pick our 10 favorites, and we'll send you guys, the 10 winners, a copy of the board game Endangered. So tomorrow's the last day to participate in that. So go to our social media channels and help us celebrate Endangered Species Day. So during the coronavirus outbreak, while humans have been sheltering in place, there's been a lot of media coverage of wild animals moving into spaces that humans usually dominate. And this really tells the story that we need to do a better job sharing the planet instead of dominating the planet. And no species is more persecuted than wolves in that respect. Wolves are kind of the epitome of the wild and have long been persecuted by humans, and they're so important in biodiversity and the extinction crisis. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, they chased the lazy ungulates off the riverbanks, and that caused trees to grow back, which improved the water quality, which caused frogs to come back and migratory songbirds. So wolves are kind of the cornerstone of healthy wilderness areas. And today we're going to do a deep dive with two of our staff who are Western wolf advocates. So I'm excited about that. First, a few technical notes. We've disabled the chat bar because we heard from you guys that was really distracting. But at the end, we're going to do questions and answers. So you can type in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can today. The ones that we don't get to, you can either email to us, or Amaroq and I will be on Slack tomorrow from noon to 1 Pacific to answer your follow-up questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amaroq and Michael, our Western wildlife advocates, to introduce themselves.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Amaroq Weiss, and I know many of you that are on the webinar today are people who are ardent wolf advocates that I've been in contact with over many years. So thank you so much for your support for wolves. I'm the center's senior West Coast wolf advocate. I'm a biologist and former attorney. I have had the amazing good fortune to work in wolf advocacy in multiple regions of the country for a number of years, many years. And my chief focus is on getting wolves back and recovered and protected long-term to thrive here in the West Coast, in Washington, Oregon, and California. Michael, want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Michael Robinson. I'm a senior conservation advocate with Center for Biological Diversity. I live in rural New Mexico, southwestern New Mexico, right at the edge of the Gila National Forest, where, as I'll be discussing a little bit, Mexican gray wolves roam. And happy to be talking with everybody. Thank you to everyone who's joining our webinar.
All right, thanks you guys. And my neighbor's dog is barking, so I hope you guys can't hear that. Amaroq, can you start off by explaining the connection between the Endangered Species Act and wolves?
You bet. So wherever wolves have been restored, or wherever they're just starting to return, it's because of the Endangered Species Act that is even possible. Most of you know that when European settlers came to this country, they made this concerted effort to tame the wilderness. But in reality, what that really meant was the slaughter of millions of native peoples, native wildlife, and especially wolves, and all of which have been living here for thousands and thousands of years. And then wolf eradication campaigns that were led by settlers and later by the federal government on behalf of the livestock operation basically wiped out wolves throughout the lower 48 United States, pretty much all gone by the 1930s. It was decades later that we had attitude shifts in society towards environmental protection. And so finally in the 1970s, some of the most significant environmental laws in the world were passed. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, and most importantly for wolves, the Federal Endangered Species Act. Now, once the gray wolf was listed under the Act for Protection, that meant that the federal government was now required to develop recovery plans for wolves. If we go to the next slide, please. Thank you, Ash. So even though gray wolves once ranged nationwide and they were listed nationwide in the lower 48, wolf recovery was planned for only 3 parts of the country. And that's shown here on this map in these blue crosshatched areas. So this was in the northern Rocky Mountain states of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, in the western Great Lakes states of Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and then in a portion of the Southwest in Arizona and New Mexico. But there exists so much more habitat where wolves could exist if protections remained in place and more federal recovery actions were taken. Now, the green on this map shows areas that have been identified so far by scientists of where there's still great habitat for wolves. And this totals 530,000 square miles. Yet today, wolves only occupy 1/3 of that square mileage. And in fact, wolves today only occupy less than 10 to 15% of what they originally occupied historically throughout the lower 48. But U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has regardless repeatedly tried to wash its hands of wolf recovery. And in fact, it's tried to strip wolves of wolf protections in the western Great Lakes states and in the northern Rockies. And it never really developed a sound wolf recovery program in the Southwest. Then in 2011, Congress stepped in, and Congress stripped wolves of protections in the northern Rockies and also in portions of Washington, Oregon, and Utah. And many of you know that the Trump administration right now has a proposal to strip wolves of federal protections across almost the entire lower 48 United States. This would be calamitous. When wolves lose federal protections and states assume sole management authority, wolves totally lose out. When there's wolf livestock conflicts, the states have made little or no effort to use non-lethal measures to follow the science, which concludes that killing wolves is counterproductive, that it's far more costly and way less effective than using non-lethal conflict prevention methods at the start. States also enact aggressive hunting and trapping seasons that are designed to take their wolf populations down to bare bone numbers. And then some states go even further than that. Some states hold wolf hunting contests. Some even pay bounties for wolves to be killed in bone crushing traps. And there's even one state that allows wolves to be chased by snowmobiles to exhaustion and then run over. So removing Federal Endangered Species Act protections for wolves not only prevents their chances for recovering in more places, it really unleashes the worst of human behavior and attitudes towards wolves. And the Endangered Species Act itself is under attack. In the past year, the Trump administration has significantly weakened key provisions of the act, which places all imperiled species at risk. The Center has fought for decades for wolves and for the Endangered Species Act, and we will continue our fight to protect and restore wolves in more places and to restore the Endangered Species Act.
So Amaroq, how does the Endangered Species Act and state wolf management play out on the West Coast?
Well, let's take a look. Next slide, please. So this map shows wolf habitat in Washington, Oregon, and California. And the brown and the crosshatched areas are where wolves currently range. The green areas show where there's still this other great wolf habitat that's yet to be occupied. And wolves started to return to the West Coast in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And why was that possible? Well, first of all, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as part of recovering wolves, reintroduced wolves to central Idaho and Yellowstone National Park in 1995 and 1996. Those wolves formed packs and established territories, and then they had offspring. And then their offspring had offspring, and then their offspring's offsprings had offspring. And so by the late 1990s, early 2000s, some of Idaho's reintroduced wolves' grandpuppies started heading west to Oregon and to Washington. And within a decade from that, some of Oregon's wolves started heading into California. So then second, in all 3 of these West Coast states, wolves had Federal Endangered Species Act protections already in place. So that meant that any wolves coming in from Idaho or wherever else, they were automatically protected in those states. And then third, wolves in Washington and Oregon were also already protected by their state's Endangered Species Act. And after wolves came to California, the center and allies got wolves protected under California state law as well. So each of these 3 states has begun to develop a wolf population, though they're all still in the really early stages of recovery. Each of these states has recently come out with updated wolf numbers. Washington currently has between 108 and 145 estimated wolves. Oregon has a confirmed 158 wolves, and California has fewer than a dozen. But then, back to Congress, back to that 2011 delisting, Congress actually stripped federal protections from wolves in the eastern 1/3 of Oregon and the eastern 1/3 of Washington. And then in 2015, Oregon prematurely stripped wolves of the state protections there. And Washington's state endangered species law is really very weak. So what that means is that in both eastern Oregon and eastern Washington, the state wildlife agencies can and do kill wolves there for livestock conflicts.
That's terrible. So tell us more about wolves and wolf management in each of those states, and what are some of the successes and challenges?
Yeah, sure. Let's start with Washington. So Washington's first wolf pack was confirmed in 2008, and then in 2011, the state adopted a wolf conservation and management plan. But then the state wildlife agency took wolf management away from its endangered species staff and turned it over to its game management staff. And that's a very different lens to look at a species as a game animal versus as an endangered species. Well, then right after that, wolves lost federal protections in eastern Washington. And since then, the state has been ignoring key science and key principles in its own state wolf plan. Since 2012, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has killed 31 state endangered wolves on behalf of the for-profit private livestock industry. Of those wolves, 90% of them were killed on our public lands. Of those wolves, 84% of the wolves were killed for the same ranching operation that refuses to adequately watch over its cattle. And most of the killing has occurred in the northeastern part of the state, which you can see here from this map is where most of Washington's wolf packs reside. And there have been multiple problems with how Washington conducts wolf management there. And I'll just give you a few examples. So a recent law enforcement investigation revealed that people that the state agency had hired to ride the range and on horseback and monitor cattle and keep them safe from wolves actually were not out on the range riding when they claimed to be. So they may have defrauded the state out of thousands of dollars, and the case has actually been referred to the DA's office for prosecution. But worse than that, even though the agency had strong reason to suspect that the range riders weren't out there and conflicts were mounting up, when conflicts happened, the agency killed wolves anyway. And then we've all too often learned that when the state wildlife agency has issued a kill order on wolves, they knew that quality non-lethal deterrents actually had not been in place, such as salt blocks for cattle. A number of times salt blocks for cattle were placed near wolf den or rendezvous sites. And even once it was discovered that the salt blocks were too close to those key wolf use sites, no efforts were made to remove the blocks. That attracted cattle right to the wolves, conflict started, and wolves ended up being shot by the agency. Then recently, we've had in Washington local sheriff's offices who have announced that they want to have their own staff go out and trap and radio collar wolves instead of having wildlife biologists do it. And I think the larger, more chronic challenge for Washington's wolves has been that for the past 7 years, the state agency has relied on a citizen advisory group to help it craft a protocol to determine how to address livestock wolf conflicts. The problem is the protocol contains no actual requirements of livestock operators, and it's also not enforceable, which means the agency's free to do whatever it wants, and it does do whatever it wants. So the center and private citizens have actually filed several lawsuits against the state, and this repeated wolf killing has the public totally outraged, to the point where last fall, Washington Governor Jay Inslee wrote to the director of the State Wildlife Agency and said that the annual killing of wolves in northeastern Washington is simply unacceptable. And he directed the agency to come up with different solutions. And this week, the center and our allies took new legal action. We filed an administrative petition with the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission that oversees the state agency. We are proposing that the state adopt enforceable rules, which require agency transparency and require the use of non-lethal measures to ensure the killing of wolves is a very last resort. And so our petition on that to the commission may actually be on the commission's agenda at their June meeting, which is going to be June 11th through the 13th. but it will be a webinar. Nobody's holding public meetings there. But so stay tuned on that, because we will provide information for you of how to get involved as we get closer to that meeting date. But let's move on to Oregon. Next slide, please. So like Washington, Oregon's first wolf pack also was confirmed in 2008. And Oregon also crafted a state wolf conservation and management plan, but they did their plan in 2005, even before they had their first wolf pack established there. However, in 2011, the center and allies had to sue the state because it was ignoring its wolf plan and it was killing wolves too quickly. The result was much stronger protections and enforceable requirements of the state agency and of livestock operators to use non-lethal measures before wolves could be killed. And the agency has increased its emphasis on non-lethal measures. It's actually hired more staff just last year to teach livestock operators how to use those measures. And this seems to be paying off, because last year, Oregon's wolf population increased by 15% from the year before, but livestock wolf conflicts decreased by 43%, and the agency didn't kill any wolves last year. And so, although this sounds all really promising, remember that wolf recovery in Oregon is still really in its infancy. This map shows where Oregon's wolf packs currently live. And again, you can see most of them are up in the northeast corner of the state. But where they're living, even with those few packs on the west side, this is only in 12% of the identified suitable habitat for wolves in Oregon. So there's a lot more room for growth and distribution. Other things are of concern in Oregon. So for instance, last year, 5 wolves were killed by people striking them with their vehicles. And maybe one of the reasons we're not seeing more wolves on the west side of the state is that highways and interstates are becoming an obstacle for wolf dispersal. And then many of you know too that recently the state revised its state wolf plan in ways that open the door to wolf hunting and wolf trapping. So we're paying very close attention. We're going to alert you if your voice is needed for Oregon's wolves. I'll give you one last piece of information, recent update on Oregon's wolves. So at the top, the second to the left picture there, that wolf with an elk leg in its mouth, that's wolf OR7 carrying dinner or breakfast back to his family. This is legendary wolf OR7. I'm going to talk about a little bit in more detail when we talk about California. But we've learned from the agency recently that OR7 likely has died. He hasn't been seen with his Oregon pack since last October. And if he were still alive this spring, he'd be 11 years old, which is like Methuselah age for a wolf. So it wouldn't be surprising if he's passed away by now. But he lived a long and celebrated and world-famous life, and he really left an indelible legacy for wolf recovery in Oregon and in California. So let's go to California. Next slide, please. Oregon wolf OR7 was the first known wolf to come into California in 87 years. So he was born in 2009 in northeastern Oregon. He crossed the state of Oregon when he was about 2 years old, and then he dropped down into California. And his timing was absolutely impeccable, because he crossed into California on December 28th of 2011, which happened to be the 38th anniversary of the passage of the Endangered Species Act and its signing into law. And when he crossed the state border, wolves already had federal protections in California, but his arrival there spurred the center and allies to petition the state, and were successful in getting wolves listed under California's State Endangered Species Act as well. And California, just like Washington and Oregon, developed a state wolf plan. And as part of that plan, modeling studies were done to determine where is there suitable habitat for wolves in California. So on the slide, in that map on the left, all of those dark gray areas has been identified as great wolf habitat. And it's around 26,000 miles. But the really fun thing is that the wolves that have dispersed into California, they've ground truthed that map. Wolves have been traveling throughout California in almost all of the areas, at least up to the north of all of that gray area so far. So we can expect them to go down further south too. Now, OR7 eventually returned to Oregon, where he found a mate, formed the rogue pack, and had pups 5 years in a row. And several other Oregon wolves have come to California, including at least 3 of OR7's pups. So as far as packs, the Shasta pack was the first pack confirmed in California in nearly 100 years. And they were confirmed in Siskiyou County in the summer of 2015. This all-black 7-member pack, however, mysteriously disappeared just a few months later after they were implicated in livestock conflicts. And in California's second and only currently known existing pack is the Lassen pack, which ranges across Lassen and Plumas counties, which is that yellow demarcated area there on the map to the right. So this pack was confirmed in 2017, and its breeding male is one of OR7's son. And the female came all the way from the Northern Rockies, where she met up with the male. They formed their pack. They had pups for 3 years in a row, but the breeding male has not been seen since last June. Now, other wolves that come to California, among them is one who entered California in December 2018. Unfortunately, he was illegally shot and killed only a week later. There's an ongoing law enforcement investigation, and the center has contributed money to a reward to help find his killer. Another wolf is wolf OR54, who's a daughter of OR7, and she came into California in January of 2018. She stayed for 2 years, and she traveled even more miles than her famous father. In her search for love, she traveled over almost 9,000 miles. Tragically, in February, she was found dead, and her cause of death has not yet been revealed by agency officials. When we learn anything, we'll let you know. So today there are around 6 to 8 wolves known to be in California, and we're going to show you a short trail cam video of members of the Lassen pack, and this was taken just last summer. Hopefully the video will go. So that's the breeding female. She's got a collar on. It's no longer working. There's one of the pups from 2019, a couple more coming in. And then the bigger wolf is a subadult pup, a teenager from the 2018 litter. This is what a lot of the terrain looks like in their territory. And the pups have discovered some elk poop. Yum-o. Crazy, beautiful sound.
Is that the We Found Elk Poo celebration chorus of howls?
That's the elk poop happy song.
So is there anything else you'd like to tell us about wolves on the West Coast?
Yeah, I'm just going to finish up with a little bit of information about the Alexander Archipelago wolves, which also inhabit the West Coast, but much farther north, as this map shows. So the Alexander Archipelago wolf is actually a rare subspecies of gray wolf. It inhabits the coastal rainforest of Southeast Alaska, mostly in the Tongass National Forest. And these wolves are harmed by a very long history of logging of its old growth forest habitat on the Tongass National Forest, but also by trapping and hunting. And this logging also is harmful for its main prey, which is the Sitka black-tailed deer. The Prince of Wales Island, which is that square down there in Southwest Alaska, actually supports a substantial portion of the Alexander Archipelago wolf. And in shocking news, in the past 2 months trapping season, 165 out of the 170 wolves that live on that island were killed. And this happened because the state of Alaska eliminated any limits on hunting and trapping of wolves. and eliminated any in-season monitoring of the hunting and trapping that was going on there. So the center has called upon the state and federal officials to stop the hunting and trapping, to give them full protections that they deserve. We actually have an action alert up right now on our website that you can use to take action. And the center and our allies also will be filing a petition with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to try to get the Alexander Archipelago wolf protected under the Endangered Species Act.
That is so heartbreaking. How can our members help?
Well, I think there's three things that you should always think about doing, and they're actually pretty easy things to do. So one of them is take action when we send you alerts. And that's because there is so much happening on the ground with wolves. I think it's hard to know which actions to take, whether or not they're actually going to be effective. And we really make it our priority to know what's going on and to analyze and figure out what is the most likely way that your voice is going to have impact. So if we're asking you to call or email or testify, it's because we think your voice is going to make a difference. And then secondly, support the national and local groups that are working on wolves. We're all lawyers and scientists and advocates, but we can't do our work without your support. You are a voice for wolves too. And then third, do everything you can to educate everyone you know about wolves and about how important they are. I mean, the main reason wolves have been so persecuted is there's so many myths and lies and misunderstandings about them. So write and call your state and federal elected officials, write letters to the editor, and make sure you just keep telling your friends and family. You know, we're all sheltering in place now. It's a great time to show wolf films at home, right?
So why do you love wolves? What do you love about them?
You know, when you look at wolves, you become absolutely mesmerized by their wild grace and their beauty and their power. And I guess that's love, but I think it's more than that. You know, I think after feeling that way, and then when you get a chance to study wolves and you learn how ecologically essential they are, you just think, man, if nature were an athletic event, wolves would be crowned its most valuable player. Now I could go on, but there's lots of reasons to love wolves.
I love it. Thank you, Amaroq. So now we're going to turn to Michael Robinson. He is going to talk to us about wolves in Arizona and New Mexico. So Michael, what is a Mexican wolf?
Mexican wolf is a subspecies of the gray wolf. It's actually called the Mexican gray wolf. And Ash, if you could, oh great, thanks for putting the slide on. It's the southernmost subspecies of gray wolf in North America. They're somewhat different morphologically as well as genetically. Morphologically, they're a little bit smaller on average than wolves that are further north. They don't have a pure black, or for that matter, a pure white phase. Rather, they have shades of gray and rufous and various iterations of gray, essentially. They're slightly different in other respects, very nuanced differences, but slightly different dentition in their mouths, and they have unique genetics as well. That, of course, is what expresses their morphological differences.
So, do they use the same habitat as other wolves? What kind of habitat do they like?
Well, as I mentioned, they're the southernmost subspecies of gray wolf, and they inhabit, as their name suggests, they evolved in part in Mexico, in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, and also in the southwestern United States. And they utilized a lot of different habitats within that. As you can see in this slide here, this animal, this Mexican gray wolf, is in desert habitat, and they certainly use that. But there's also a lot people don't realize, who don't spend time in the Southwest. There's forests. Next slide, please. There's forest habitat as well. There's mesas and mountains. This is the Gila National Forest near where I live, a mixture of ponderosa pine trees and juniper trees and oaks, and as you can see, also grasslands and sort of rolling mountains. So they really are very adaptable. They will survive wherever there is adequate prey, and of course, where human beings will let them survive.
So where do they live now? Tell us about their range.
Their range now is a small part of their original range. In this slide, you can see of Arizona and New Mexico includes a delineation in that little that dotted line across about two-thirds of the way up from northward in Arizona and New Mexico, and then encompassing everything or almost everything to the south of that, to the border with Mexico. That's the area that Mexican gray wolves are allowed to roam by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but they actually occupy a pretty small portion of that. You can see in that map, there's a shade of green kind of going west to east and a little bit north to south across the middle of the map there. That's the Mogollon Plateau or Mogollon Rim. And they're close to the Arizona-New Mexico border on both sides of the border in that forested country there. And the next slide will show a little bit more about what that country looks like. And then this is a wolf in the Gila National Forest, Mexican wolf in the Gila National Forest several years ago. If you turn to the slide after that, I'll show you the exact locations from the most recent flight reports. Every few weeks, the Fish and Wildlife Service posts online a map showing precisely where wolves are located in the Southwest. And you can see the vertical line there is what separates Arizona on the left from New Mexico on the right. And this is essentially a portion of both of those states on the Mogollon Rim, as I indicated. Some of those red dots indicate more than one wolf, but you can see there's not that very many wolves altogether. 163 at last count in the wild in the United States. And you'll see a few there's most of the dots there are in part of the Apache National Forest in Arizona, and then the Gila National Forest in New Mexico. You can see a few of those dots outside of the Gila in other green areas, which is a different national forest, the Cibola National Forest, as well as on some of the white lands there, which is BLM public lands. Those were areas that wolves were not allowed to roam until 2015, when thanks to a Center for Biological Diversity petition and follow-up lawsuit, we compelled the Fish and Wildlife Service to let wolves roam on a much broader landscape, as indicated in that previous map.
There doesn't seem like very many wolves. Why are they imperiled? What's threatening them?
Yeah, there aren't very many wolves, and they are the most endangered among the wolves in North America, and one of the most endangered mammals altogether. This is a sign that was tacked onto a tree, a big ponderosa pine tree in New Mexico about a century ago, and it really tells the story in part of why these wolves are endangered. And the sign was put up, as you can see, by the United States Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Biological Survey, Predatory Animal Control, and that actually is the predecessor agency to the current U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that is charged and responsible for recovering wolves. But what they were doing then is very different. Please do not interfere with steel traps in this locality, you can see the sign read. The government is going to much expense in an effort to exterminate the wild animals, and the cooperation of the public is desired in seeing that traps of the hunters are not disturbed. And that really tells the story. They were setting leg hold traps and killing the animals in the traps. They were putting out poison specifically for wolves, as well as coyotes and other predators. And it was all on behalf of the livestock industry. And what that led to was by 1945, the last wolves in the entire Western United States, the very last one had been killed by what was then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That was the very last one that I was able to document was in southern Colorado. But starting in 1950, the U.S. government even started sending its experienced wolf trappers and poisoners to Mexico with their custom concocted poisons as a foreign aid program to kill off the wolves in Mexico. And after that, very few wolves were crossing the border into the United States, and they would have been exterminated entirely if it wasn't for the last moment, if you will, or very timely passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. Next slide, please. Only 7 wolves survived the extermination program that was led by the U.S. government in both the U.S. and Mexico. Survived and were successfully bred in captivity. They were caught in the wild, most of them after the Endangered Species Act passed, but there were some that had been already in captivity and had been bred, in some cases kind of as a curiosity, prior to that. So these 7 surviving animals that successfully were bred in captivity formed the basis for all the surviving Mexican wolves that we know of in the world today, and the basis for a future reintroduction program that, as it happens, was prompted by Center for Biological Diversity litigation with our allies, and led to releases of wolves in 1998. And you can see the next slide, please. The problem is that some of the same management is close to as unenlightened as it was 100 years ago. And there's still, of course, a lot of political pressure from the livestock industry to harm these wolves. And with the base of only having 7 wolves survive this era of extermination from a century or so ago, that's a pretty limited genetic base for the survivors going forward. And that's another reason that they're really in deep peril at the moment.
So is the government actually working to recover wild Mexican wolf populations?
Well, it's kind of with one hand, yes, and with the other hand, no. It's, or, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Here's a more current sign set out by the successor to the agency that 100 years ago put out that bleak sign that we saw a couple of minutes ago. This one says, "Warning, pet owners, please take notice. Pet owners are advised that foothold traps have been placed behind the sign to capture wildlife for management purposes." And the management purposes are, it's removing wolves from the wild on behalf of the livestock industry. And that's happened over and over again. Management that's really not done the wolves any good, even though the law calls for their recovery. You can see the next slide here shows a crate full of pups, newborn pups that had been removed from the wild by the U.S. government because their parents had been preying on livestock. Unfortunately, these are genetically valuable wolves that ultimately were not allowed to be part of the population going forward. And sometimes it's even worse than that, as the next slide indicates. It's an airplane that is used periodically by the U.S. government to shoot wolves from the air. And we found out that happened as recently as late March. And we put out a press release that really excoriated the Fish and Wildlife Service for really bad management and bad judgment, and frankly, heartless management, in my view. In this case, 3 pups were gunned down. They specifically targeted pups, as well as the papa wolf of one of the pups. It was from 2 different wolf families. And this has happened over and over again. The government officials have shot a total of 20 wolves, and 22 wolves over the course of reintroduction since 1998 have died inadvertently as a consequence of their capture from the wild. And coupled with that, not enough wolves have been released from captivity to prevent an ongoing deterioration in the genetics of the wolves. Next slide, please. There is some good news, and that is that the numbers of wolves are finally increasing significantly. And that is, after all, of course, what the Fish and Wildlife Service is supposed to do to recover this endangered species. The chart that goes up to 2006 and ends with 102 wolves, that's the projected number of wolves. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service's projected number of wolves before they reintroduced them, basically using the same formula that had proved an underestimate of wolf population growth when wolves had been reintroduced 3 years earlier in Yellowstone National Park in central Idaho. But when it began in 1998, here in the Southwest, the population was a lot more up and down. You can see that the line underneath that terminates in 163 wolves has some significant downturns, and that's as a result of persecution of the government shooting and trapping wolves. The last few years, in part because of litigation from our organization and from our allies, has seen more wolves being allowed to live, and the numbers thankfully have gone up to 163 wolves. We're very grateful about that. It basically gives us a bit of a sigh of relief. They're not going to be all wiped out in some terrible catastrophe, for example, a widespread forest fire or a disease or something of that nature. Gives them a little bit more of a margin. The last 2 lines show the one that terminates at 18 in 2006 was the projection of the number of breeding pairs of Mexican wolves on the landscape. And you can see that the number, the line below that, that terminates in 10 in 2016, has been significantly lower than that. Now, in 2015, they changed the definition of a breeding pair to make it seem that there are more, and it's been very hard to correlate the new definition to the standards of the old definition and have a consistent line. So we basically stopped it there. But the bottom line is there aren't that many wolves that are actually breeding out there. And most worrisome, the genetics of this wolf population are going downward. Genetic diversity is actually being lost. So are they being recovered? Well, under one metric, yes, there's more wolves than there has been in the Southwest for 100 years or more. On the other hand, the trends are not all good. Some of them are quite worrisome.
So tell us more about your work to help these wolves. What's the center doing?
The center's been involved from the very beginning. As I mentioned, we have been, we litigated to get the reintroduction underway at the very outset, and we've been monitoring what's been going on. We certainly have put a lot of pressure on the Fish and Wildlife Service, including through working with scientists who can express the scientific damage that's being done, put pressure on them to stop the killing and the trapping of wolves. And I'm convinced there's significant numbers of wolves in the wild now that would not be if it wasn't for the pressure also of a lot of people who've chimed in on our action alerts and made calls and the like. We are also pushing for releases of wolves from captivity using effective means so the wolves actually survive to enhance the genetics. One of our successes that's very germane right now is we won a very important lawsuit against the management rule that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to justify what we consider mismanagement, the removal of wolves from the wild for political reasons and the slow walking of wolf releases from captivity. We won that lawsuit. Fish and Wildlife Service now has an open public comment period on the scope of the changes that they will need to make in developing their future management rule. And the judge gave them till May 21st of 2021, so just about a year, to finalize a new management rule. And they're in the process now of reviewing the public's comments or accepting public comments. Not sure why that slide's going up, but maybe we can see the next one. In any event, we do have an action alert that's on our website and will be sent, I believe, to all of our list, everybody presumably who's viewing this, that'll be going out tomorrow morning, asking you to chime in and tell the Fish and Wildlife Service exactly what they should be evaluating and ultimately what they should be implementing in terms of changed management of Mexican wolves. So I'm very excited about this opportunity to end some of the abuses of the past and start on a new direction for Mexican wolves.
So our members can help by taking action on that action alert when they get it. Well, thank you, Michael. We've got 15 minutes left, so let's go to questions. You guys can send us your questions in the question thing in chat, and we will see those. Let's see here. So there's, on our website, there's an action alert for the Alexander Archipelago wolves. Amaroq, do you want to give us a little bit more detail about that? You're on mute.
I just realized that. Yeah, so as I said before, we do have an action alert up right now, and the action alert is aimed at getting the attention of department officials in Alaska Department of Fish and Game, as well as at the federal level with the U.S. Forest Service. You know, in the past, we have petitioned to get the Alexander Archipelago wolf listed, and the service denied it for completely unfounded reasons. And in addition to this trapping and hunting that's been going on there, the Trump administration has proposed massive logging projects throughout the Tongass National Forest, and even to get rid of the roadless rule in that national forest as well. So these issues are really kind of intertwined. So when you use our action alert, you can talk about the importance of protecting these wolves, the importance of saving this habitat, not just for the wolves, but also for their prey that live there, and God, for posterity, for the fact that we need to have these wild places left. So yeah, it's on our website now, and I think we'll get it posted on our a link to it on our Slack channel for tomorrow when you and I are doing question and answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I think this question is for Michael. What impact is Trump's border wall having on Lobos migration in Southwest New Mexico?
Well, it's a catastrophe for so many different species of wildlife. There has been a population of wolves reintroduced in Mexico. The reintroduction just started 9 years ago, and there's only about 30 wolves on the ground. Clearly, that population, for genetic viability, needs connectivity to the population of Mexican gray wolves in Arizona and New Mexico. There have been wolves that have crossed the border, and of course, those crossings are being walled off right now. And we just filed a lawsuit, I believe it was yesterday or today even, to try and stop some of the last wild areas that are still can still function as migratory corridors from being walled off by the Trump administration. And I should say that the wolves in the United States also need the wolves in Mexico for the same reasons. They're not genetically viable here in the United States, a long ways from that. So these wolves need connectivity. They need to be able to find each other. And the same is true for a lot of different animals, both the more common ones, whether we're talking about animals like deer or coyotes or bobcats or whatever else. All of these are blocked by walls, but there's also quite a lot of very, very imperiled wildlife animals, including endangered jaguars that at the moment in the United States can the number of jaguars we have now is maybe less than a handful, and we're entirely dependent on jaguars in Mexico for any continuation of jaguars inhabiting the southwestern United States. So there's a lot of species well known, as well as those that are less well known and commonly seen, as well as the more cryptic and very rare ones that are very imperiled by this border wall.
So the wall is a disaster, and we're going to fight it tooth and nail, basically.
Absolutely. And you know what? One other thing to think about, I mean, we're taking these terrible losses under the Trump administration, and obviously not just for wildlife, but human communities as well. But in terms of the wall, I think we need to think long term and tear out every darn inch that they have constructed of the wall when we're back to sane governance in the United States.
Hear, hear. So here's a question that's been asked 5 times already. Given the Yellowstone gray wolf reintroduction success, how do we counteract the current mindset of total eradication of such an important species?
So the thing that's kind of odd about this is that whenever you read a newspaper article, you're going to see the media set it up to show that there's all this opposition to wolves, and that's really not the case. Surveys that have been done nationwide show that people overwhelmingly support wolves and support the Endangered Species Act and want continued protections. And even surveys that are done like in Washington, Oregon, California, again, the media tries to set this up as a rural-urban divide, and it's just not the case. Because when the surveys break things out according to the east side versus the west side of the state, the rural communities versus the urban communities, you see that there's still incredible support for wolves. I mean, I think in Oregon, one of their surveys showed that opposition to trophy hunting of wolves was even higher in the rural part of the state than the urban part of the state. It was like 82% opposed trophy hunting of wolves and 79% in the urban areas opposed it. So there is this mythology, and gee, I think we're not all surprised that there's mixed messages in the media, and what are we meant to believe? So part of that is helping people who maybe are on the fence, maybe don't know too much about wolves, help them understand what wolves are all about, and that these terrible stories they're reading aren't true. They're completely out of context. I mean, to show you how out of context this stuff is, this is where facts are really important to help people, because they say, and I believe it's probably true for most people, facts aren't what convince them, emotions will. But I think you can feel both an emotional and a factual response when I tell you that in the state of Washington, there's nearly 1.2 million cattle. And there's less than 145 state endangered wolves, and yet they've killed 31 of them. In Oregon, there's nearly 1.3 million cattle, and there's only 158 wolves there. And there, over the last same period of time of Washington, they've killed 16 wolves. Oregon's been a little bit better than Washington in that respect. But so part of it is helping people understand the context that most livestock are not killed by wolves. You know, the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service puts out a huge report every couple of years on death losses of livestock. And what it shows is that 90 to 95% of livestock losses are due to causes that have nothing to do with any predator of any kind. Most livestock losses, 90 to 95%, are due to things like disease, dehydration, starvation, birthing complications, ingesting poisonous weeds. On the other hand, that remaining 5% that's caused by wildlife, of that, wolves are at the very, very bottom. They cause like 0.02% of any predations on livestock anywhere. So, I mean, I think that those are facts that kind of sink home with some emotional resonance. So part of it is simple education over and over to let people know that although wolf country blazes headlines that make it sound like there's a wolf catastrophe happening out there, the catastrophe is what's happening to the wolves, not what's happening to the livestock.
Is a question? Go ahead, Michael.
Add something very briefly. You know, this is a classic case of a special interest that has seized control of government policy in contravention to what the public at large feels. And the flip side of that is this is a classic case for American democracy to reassert itself with values that are very widely shared of conservation, protection of endangered species, restoration of ecosystems, and a proper place for profit-making businesses on the public lands. And that is a secondary place to the ecological integrity of those public lands. And I think that's the challenge we have, and it's a winnable challenge. We've made tremendous progress and will continue to do so.
Yeah, in our Saving Life on Earth policy plan, we're calling for public lands to be managed to benefit biodiversity and not for-profit interests. Along these same lines, there's a question about how effective are deterrence and non-lethal methods for wolf livestock conflict.
You want to jump on that, Michael, or would you like me to start?
Why don't you start, Amaroq, and then I'll add a couple of things maybe about carrion disposal and how it affects Mexican wolves.
Sure. So whether or not non-lethal measures work depend upon several factors, including, is it the right method for the type of terrain you're on, for the time of year it's happening, therefore, what is the age and population composition of the livestock that are out there? What's the age and population composition of the wild ungulate prey that would be out there as a preferred prey source for wolves? And what is the age and population structure and time of development of the wolf population? So for instance, if it's a large public lands grazing allotment that's thousands and hundreds of thousands of acres, you're not going to be able to take fladry, that red flagging that you can hang on a fence line, and put that around that whole grazing allotment as a deterrent to wolves. That's a situation where you would use something like range riders, people who are out there on horseback, and they're not just out there on horseback looking for wolves. This is another point. Non-lethal measures not only have to be used, but they have to be used appropriately. So the whole point of having range riders out there is to monitor the cattle, to make sure they can see where the cattle are, keep them bunched up so they can be protected, keep them bunched up so they can see if there's injured or sick livestock, they should pull off the range so that they won't be attractants to predators. Noticing if they're feeling stressed, noticing if they're getting too close to a known wolf or den or rendezvous site and moving them away. So there's specific things that you have to do. So in a large grazing allotment like that, something like range riders is really key. It's also really key to on areas that are maybe smaller fence pastures to be able to use something like this technique called flattery, which is this ripstop cording. It's long red flags. You hang it on a fence line. It's a psychological barrier. Wolves don't like it. They find it really scary. It'll work for about 60, 63 days is what we've seen in research studies. Sometimes that is all you need though. Maybe those 2 months are just the period when your calves or your lambs are in night pens or lambing pens, and they can be protected until they're older and better able to defend themselves. So even if it's short term, it can be a really good device. Radio activated guard boxes can be great. These are devices you put on fence lines. They have loudspeakers, and when radio collared wolves approach, you set the box up so it will trigger when it catches the signal of the radio collared wolf. And when it catches that signal, it sends off sounds that like apocalypse now. It sounds like, helicopters and guns going off, whatever you've recorded. It could be rock and roll music, but it scares the wolves away. And so these are just a few things. Biofencing is another thing that's being experimented with, where you're actually putting wolf urine on areas along a territory to make the wolves that come in go away, because wolves know when they smell another wolf's urine that that's a dangerous place for them to go, and maybe I better head the other direction. But the key point is that it really has to be adapted for the type of operation, the time of year, what's going on life cycle wise with what type of livestock, and what's going on life cycle wise at that moment in time with the livestock, the wild ungulate prey, and the wolves.
And as Amaroq said, so much depends on the specifics of the locality and the terrain. In the Southwest, what we're finding is that there aren't very many conflicts. Wolves prey on and feed on elk for over 90% of their diet, and most of the rest is deer. But those conflicts that do occur tend to happen over and over again in the same places. It's not random, and it indicates, to turn a phrase that the management agencies use that to turn it to better purpose, they talk about problem wolves. I like to refer to problem grazing allotments, because these are places over and over again that seem to attract wolves only to lead to the wolves' destruction ultimately, or removal from the wild into captivity. And what we found is that in some cases, there's just such high stocking rates that the cattle don't fare very well. They die of non-wolf causes. For example, disease, lightning, poisonous weeds, birthing problems, all kinds of things, accidents. We've had cases of cattle dying from falling off cliffs. They presumably were at the edge of a cliff because that's where they could find a little bit of extra grass. And the wolves then scavenge on the carrion. And, if the wind is blowing the right direction and there's a 600-pound dead cow, a wolf can smell that from far away, is drawn to that cow, scavenges. And what we've seen over and over again is that wolves that are brought into close proximity to livestock that are already vulnerable, where there's dead cattle, there's oftentimes cattle that are in very bad shape. I've seen in one case a cow that was apparently sick and couldn't even get to its feet, but it was alive. And the wolves then transitioned to preying on live livestock, and then they're seen as problem wolves, depredators, whatever the term is, and the government comes in and traps or actually shoots them. And so what scientists have recommended for many, many years regarding the Mexican wolf situation and recovery of Mexican wolves is that owners of livestock using public lands be required to remove or render inedible, unpalatable, the carcasses of the livestock that they own on the public lands when those livestock die of non-wolf causes. And that can be done through lime that breaks down the flesh. It can be done through fire when there's, in the wintertime, when there's not fire danger, if there's snow on the ground. There's all kinds of ways it can be removed. If there's road access, it can be hauled away. There is public help, money available to help in these kind of things. The problem is it hasn't been made mandatory. And so these conflicts recur over and over again. And so we're with the scientific community and saying there has to be a balance, there has to be some responsibility on the part of owners of livestock with the privilege of using the public lands to actually prevent these conflicts through not drawing wolves into areas where conflicts are very likely to take place.
So I'm sorry we're out of time for questions, but Amaroq and I will be on Slack tomorrow in the Endangered Species channel to answer your questions, or you can email any of us. Next week, we're actually going to be talking about meat production, slaughterhouses, factory farms, and the extinction crisis. So we will see you at 4 o'clock next Thursday. And thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody.